we thought that their peace in Europe was something that we could rely on, and now we appreciate, as possibly we should have done after Bosnia, but we didn't, that we can't rely on it. And what we've also learned is that we can't entirely rely on the United States to share that view. It does at the moment because of its presidency, but it won't necessarily have that kind of approach consistently.
And it's that time of the morning when we speak to two of our favourite columnists. And of course, on a Tuesday, it should be Finkelstein, but David Aaronovitch isn't here. We assume he's having a spa break of some description. But we've still got Daniel Finkelstein. Morning, Danny.
Good morning.
And joining me in the studio, I think in the studio for the first time, it's Times columnist Oliver Kamm.
Morning, Matt.
Nice
Morning,
to have
Danny.
you with us. Nice to have you with us. So,
does this make us the penultimate portmanteau of the
what is it? Is it Finkelcam? Fincam? Camelvich? Camel. There's definitely something involving camels. Let's talk about Ukraine and this suggestion that Britain's concerned that France and Germany will offer President Putin an easy off-ramp. And, you know, there's a sort of concern that Putin then might get away with it. Danny, one person's getting away with it as another person's ending the war, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult question. I'd be fascinated to know what Oliver has to say. On the one hand, Boris Johnson made the right point earlier in this when he said Putin cannot be seen to win out of this kind of aggression. And when you fight as we do, it is to try to prevent this kind of aggression from seeing to gain anything. On the other hand, you've got to be able to end it at some point. So a lot depends on what we regard our capacity to see this out. And most important of all, this is about the Ukrainian people and what they decide they are willing to accept. The most important thing is that we should support them in their resistance to conditions they're not willing to accept. So it isn't as easy as it sounds initially. Initially, it sounds obvious that President Putin's been involved in war crimes, that he has to be defeated. All of us want him not to be the president of Russia anymore. But one has to also temper that kind of demand with a degree of realism, but not let one's realism bleed over into defeatism or to accepting things that one shouldn't accept. So an awful lot of this is down to the conditions on the ground, to how the Ukrainian people feel about it, to what we think Putin's both his breaking point and his stopping point are. I apologise if that's not a very conclusive answer, but I think it's actually a very messy choice. This.
But that's the problem, isn't it, Oliver? Is that people like, and particularly in this day and age with the world of social media, and they like certainty and taking a hardline position, and that's the position we should take. And actually, what Danny's just spelled out there, the idealism, realism, defeatism, and trying to find a sort of a place on that scale, that muddy scale, where ending the war has to probably be the overwhelming priority, and therefore that's going to mean dirty, horrible compromise, probably.
Yes, there are never cases, even in just wars like the Second World War, where there are clear-cut moral choices. You need to be prepared to do bad things in order to prevent worse things. And as Danny rightly says, the conditions on the ground actually matter. But let me stress the conditions on the ground. What has happened in this war that has now been going on for nearly 4 weeks is that it has persisted much, much longer than the Putin regime expected. And all the signs are that they are sustaining, the Russian forces are sustaining tremendous losses. The fatalities reportedly between 7,000 and 14,000. The Putin regime has had success militarily in its aggression before, in the case of Georgia, in the case of annexing Crimea. But these are with special forces, with regular forces. They are encountering tremendous resistance, stiff resistance, and responding with brutality against civilian targets. As Danny so rightly says, it comes down to what the Ukrainians actually want in this conflict, and they are fighting bravely. And our role, that is the Western democracy's role in this conflict, is not to be disinterested. It is to support the legitimate government in Kiev and to supply, and this is making a difference, the most advanced anti-tank, anti-aircraft, and anti-ship weapons, and impose stringent sanctions on the Russian economy. This is having an effect. Now, President Putin is a very brutal man, but he's not shy about saying what he wants. When he wants to come to the negotiating table, he will, and it is not the role of the Western democracies to negotiate behind the backs of the legitimate government of Ukraine. My only caution in the position of our own government in this is that it should not be sowing dissension among our partners in Europe. It should be cohering with the European Union, which has been very creditable and very prompt in its imposition of sanctions against the autocracy in the Kremlin.
I agree with that, and let me just add to that. We have to look forward at the moment. One of the things that's obvious is that we thought that their peace in Europe was something that we could rely on, and now we appreciate, as possibly we should have done after Bosnia, but we didn't, that we can't rely on it. And what we've also learned is that we can't entirely rely on the United States to share that view. It does at the moment because of its presidency, but it won't necessarily have that kind of approach consistently. So we're going to have to develop a European defence alliance and identity, taking into account the fact that we've left the European Union, but still left ourselves with that challenge.
And I suppose as well, because we've obviously supported with sanctions and with military, but we're not fighting this war. And so this is Ukraine's war. And it's all very nice people telling President Zelensky what he should and shouldn't be doing. But it's up to him. Because, they're not members of NATO. We're not all embroidered in the same way. So if he thinks he's doing the right thing for the people of Ukraine, it's not really anything to do with us, is it, Oliver?
It is to do with us when he calls upon us for support. The idea which President Zelensky has repeatedly urged on his allies of a no-fly zone imposed by NATO is, you can see why he does it. It is to impress upon us, upon the NATO powers, the stakes involved. And he's right to do so, but there again, we are right not to accede to it because it would escalate the conflict beyond the borders of Ukraine. This is one of the messy choices that we have to make in a just war against brutal imperialist aggression.
And what about, Danny, I mean, to some extent, were them to Ukraine and Russia to find some sort of messy compromise, and that still seems like some way off, but then you never know, it could also happen quite quickly. The way that the international community has actually responded to this, as someone's just tweeted in saying, maintain the sanctions. Were the sanctions to be maintained? The way that the West has united and responded to Putin in a way that they just haven't for the last 10, 20 years, that's already Putin is already in a worse place than he was when he started this.
Yes, he definitely is. Look, he's made a miscalculation. He's definitely made a moral miscalculation, and I think he's made a practical and political miscalculation too. And we'll see how that's going to play out. Actually, in some ways, for all the moral complexities, we do have a simple duty, and Oliver's laid it out quite well. It is to support the decisions made by the people of Ukraine, because as represented to us by their elected officials, and to support that decision while they continue to make it, and to involve ourselves in supporting any security efforts after they've secured peace on whatever basis they regard as acceptable. The most morally, I found this, I'm sure all listeners have as well, I found it immensely difficult to be saying to the Ukrainian people, you're incredibly brave, we're watching everything that you do, we want to provide you with weapons, we want to provide you with money, we want to provide you with homes, if we can, many of us, and at the same time to tell them we can't enter this war ourselves. It is unfortunately the only thing that we can do. It's anything you can prudently do. It's morally very tough. I found it very tough. So all I can really cling to is to try to support them in whatever ways that we can, to the absolute limit that we can, for as long as they decide they want it.
That's the crucial point, the absolute limit. You hear a lot in rather distant political debate over the Ukraine war about providing President Putin with an off-ramp, that is, an opportunity to climb down. This is President Putin. He will climb down when he's beaten, and our moral obligation as democratic powers is to provide the legitimate government in Ukraine with the tools to do that. They are fighting with extraordinary bravery against an adversary that has no compunction about bombing hospitals, about bombing civilian areas. We should be stepping up all the military aid that we can, increase the sanctions, not loosen them, and provide boundless welcome and support for those fleeing the conflict.
Well, this whole area is a sort of complicated moral minefield, and compromise happens, and sometimes reality makes things complicated. Another area where lots of the same things apply is how do you get hostages out of countries? And obviously, we heard we'll listen to this. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe talking yesterday in the House of Commons and questioning why it took 6 years and 5 foreign secretaries to free her.
I have seen 5 foreign secretaries changed over the course of 6 years. That is unprecedented given the politics of the UK. I love you, Richard. Respect whatever you believe. But I was told many, many times that, we're going to get you home. That never happened. So there was a time that I felt like, do you know what? I'm not even going to trust you, because I've been told many, many times that I'm going to be taken home, but that never happened. I mean, how many foreign secretaries does it take for someone to come home? 5? It should have been one of them eventually. So now here we are. What's happened now should have happened 6 years ago.
So that was Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe speaking in the House of Commons yesterday. Today, one of those foreign secretaries, Jeremy Hunt, has said that those criticising Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe have got it so wrong. She doesn't owe us gratitude. We owe her an explanation. She's absolutely right. It took too long to bring her home. He said on Twitter, I tried my best, as did other foreign secretaries, but if trying our best took 6 years, then we must be honest and say the problem should have been solved earlier. He says ministerial turnover may have been a factor. There might have been some initial reluctance to pay the debt. This is the debt owed to Iran, because people worried it would look like a ransom. But he's also backed the idea of an independent investigation to look into those failings. It's always interesting when someone calls for an independent investigation into themselves, Oliver. What do you think is the correct response to this? Because clearly it did take an incredible long time, but there are moral questions, legal questions. There's cock up and conspiracy, and both probably play a part in it too.
Yes, it was an immensely powerful statement by Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe. She has every reason to be angered by the length of time that it took to release her and that it took to secure that. I respect the position of Jeremy Hunt. I think that's a very intellectually honest call for him to make, and without anticipating the conclusions of any such inquiry, it clearly did not help Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe whatsoever that Boris Johnson, as Foreign Secretary in 2017, made a gaffe with tremendous implications, depicting her as having trained journalists in Iran. It was a culpable lack of knowledge of his own brief that had disastrous consequences, and that's something that really needs to be atoned for, never mind investigated. I would say this for the British government's position, however. Hostage taking by Iran is a long-standing problem. It hasn't been confined to dual nationals like Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe. There was the Australian academic Kylie Gilbert-Moore, who was released the other day. And it happens to maritime traffic as well. There was a South Korean ship just in January that was impounded in the Strait of Hormuz by Iran. And the South Korean government paid reportedly anywhere between $1 billion and $7 billion in frozen Iranian assets. There is a problem. Of course, the debt should have been paid by the British government a long time ago relating to the Shah of Iran's order for chieftain tanks back in 1979, shortly before he was deposed. But the theocracy in Iran is not like Denmark, it's not like Norway, it's not like Canada. It is a rogue regime that does use funds for exporting revolution and for illicit activities. And there is a moral compromise involved. It's one that the Obama administration faced up to in 2017 in a similar case when Iran made a claim of $1.7 billion for funds that the Shah of Iran had deposited in the United States in order to purchase military hardware. Excuse me. And if you pay a ransom, which is how this was perceived in the case of the Obama administration, then it does confer both diplomatic advantage and material benefit to a regime that is exporting revolution throughout a highly dangerous region. And so there is a moral compromise involved. Mrs. Zaghari Ratcliffe deserves enormous credit for her courage and her eloquence. She is not, I read someone's comment, I forget who, she is not some Disney princess celebrating the benefactors who've released her, and all credit to her for that. But there is a problem that democratic governments have with a regime that uses hostage-taking as an instrument of foreign policy.
I agree. Let me say that I agree with lots of things you've said, but not absolutely everything, Oliver. So one of the examples is that I completely agree with you that Boris Johnson's comments were a catastrophic failure of his duty as Foreign Secretary, and culpable as well. But I'm not clear that they necessarily had disastrous results. If they did not have disastrous results, that was no thanks to him. But nevertheless, we can't be sure that they did, because I'm not sure that their holding of her as hostage, as the ultimate solution suggested, had much to do ultimately with whether or not they thought she was culpable. They were guilty of anything. They knew she wasn't guilty of anything. And Boris Johnson saying that may or may not have changed the situation. So that's certainly one of the things that should be inquired into. It wouldn't excuse it, because it wouldn't have been any doing of his if it had no impact. But I wonder whether it really did. And very important to keep at the front of our mind what you said at the end there, which is this ultimately isn't the fault of the British government; it's the fault of the Iranian government. While I think two things. One is you have to be immensely sort of emotionally unintelligent, I think, to start to kind of quibble with the way that that Mrs. Zaghari Ratcliffe feels about her own experience. And you also have, you also listen to that eloquence. You can see that she's somebody worth listening to in any regard. You can just hear that. But at the same time, it's not necessary to accept absolutely that because it took a long time, that was necessarily a culpable error. I think Jeremy Hunt's right to think we ought to look into it. I'm completely open to the idea and very struck by the fact that he thinks it took longer than it should. And I think that may well be the result of the inquiry. Yeah. But I don't think we should assume that at the beginning, because it may well be that actually there was little that we could sensibly have done earlier. On the other hand, as she notes, in the end, we paid up the money and they let her go. So if we were going to do that at the end,
why not do it sooner? Yeah. And the other thing, some people are getting very cross because we're even discussing the possibility that Boris Johnson may have played a role in it and made matters worse. I mean, the fact that Boris Johnson ended up apologising in the House of Commons, not something he's prone to doing, it has to be said, suggests that he at least thought it didn't help matters. So it's worth pointing that out as well. Gentlemen, I'm afraid we've run out of time. It's been fascinating, Charles. Oliver, it's lovely to see you. I think you're going to be back with us next week as well.
I will indeed.
It's a pleasure. It's a very long spa break for David Aaronovitch. You can read Danny and Oliver in The Times every week. Just get yourself a subscription. Go to thetimes.co.uk. Sign up now. You know the score. You get your first month for free. Right, coming up in our big thing at 11, we're going to talk about what...